Good evening. I am honored to address you today in recognition of this award for which I am deeply grateful. In his memorial to William Butler Yeats, W.H. Auden wrote, "Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry." Likewise, my native land, my South, my Mississippi, with its brutal history of racism, violence, and injustice, inflicted my first wound. In my work, I examine the intersections of public and personal history, cultural and historical memory, amnesia, and erasure. This interest grows out of the kind of psychological exile I felt growing up in the Deep South, where Confederate monuments were erected, often in response to advances in civil rights, to glorify the old order, the lost cause, and white supremacy, and to remind me of my status as an outsider, a second-class citizen. I am interested too, and most excited, in what Seamus Heaney called the redress of poetry, the way that poems can tilt the scales of reality toward some transcendent equilibrium, and that it is not necessary for poets to be aiming at social change when they sit down to write, but that it can be an outcome. I began work on my most recent collection of poems, Thrall, with an exploration of Enlightenment thinking, particularly notions of racial difference and racial hierarchy, the roots of white supremacy, which were first codified by Enlightenment philosophers such as Kant and Hume. Indeed, it was Thomas Jefferson who, in Notes on the State of Virginia, first called for a kind of comparative anatomy. He proposed that if you were to cut the Negro open, you would be able to ascertain what he believed to be the root of Black inferiority. In considering the Enlightenment, I wanted also to grapple with the ongoing, deeply ingrained, and often unexamined notions of racial difference and hierarchy manifest not only in the culture at large, and even more evident now with increasingly visible forms of white supremacy and nationalism, but also in the intimate relationships within families, as with my beloved father, my white parent. My father first took me to Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home, over 30 years ago. A lot has changed there since then. It is now the official position of the Jefferson Foundation that Thomas Jefferson fathered several of Sally Hemings' children. Whereas it was once taboo to bring up the issue, the docent will now mention it prominently during the tour. Thus, the conversations at Monticello one might overhear have changed, though the ideas undergirding them more often have not. This is a poem called Enlightenment. In the portrait of Jefferson that hangs at Monticello, he is rendered two-toned, his forehead white with illumination, a lit bulb, the rest of his face in shadow, darkened as if the artist meant to contrast his bright knowledge, its dark subtext. By 1805, when Jefferson sat for the portrait, he was already linked to an affair with his slave. Against a backdrop, blue and ethereal, a wash of paint that seems to hold him in relief, Jefferson gazes out across the centuries, his lips fixed as if he's just uttered some final word. The first time I saw the painting, I listened as my father explained the contradictions, how Jefferson hated slavery, though out of necessity, my father said, had to own slaves. That his moral philosophy meant he could not have fathered those children, would have been impossible, my father said. For years, we debated the distance between word and deed. I'd follow my father from book to book, gathering citations, listening as he named, like a field guide to Virginia, each flower and tree and bird, as if to prove a man's pursuit of knowledge is greater than his shortcomings, the limits of his vision. I did not know then the subtext of our story, that my father could imagine Jefferson's words made flesh in my flesh, the improvement of the blacks in body and mind in the first instance of their mixture with the whites, or that my father could believe he'd made me better. When I think of this now, I see how the past holds us captive, its beautiful ruin etched on the mind's eye. My young father, a rough outline of the old man he's become, needing to show me the better measure of his heart, an equation writ large at Monticello. That was years ago. Now we take in how much has changed. Talk of Sally Hemings, someone asking, how white was she? Parsing the fractions as if to name what made her worthy of Jefferson's attentions, a near-white quadroon mistress, not a plain black slave. Imagine stepping back into the past, our guide tells us then, and I can't resist whispering to my father, this is where we split up. I'll head around to the back. When he laughs, I know he's grateful I've made a joke of it, this history that links us, white father, black daughter, even as it renders us other to each other. Thank you.